It was May 2nd, 1964, and I had just finished high school a few months earlier. I got a job at the local movie theater, the only one around, with the idea of saving some money before going to college and leaving our small and strict community. As you can imagine, cinemas in those days were very different to what they are now. There was a lot of censorship, and they only allowed certain films to be shown, and in places like ours, they almost always showed the same 5 films over and over again, something that, reasonably, became too boring for the younger ones in particular, as they were almost always science fiction films with a religious twist or vague adventures. This was because our community was quite religious and conservative, adoring. One day, while I was going to look for the next reel of film for the midnight show, something caught my attention. There, half buried under one of the dusty shelves, I saw an old reel of film that I hadn't noticed before. I was very curious, so I went over, dusted it off, and as I examined it, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and confusion. I couldn't believe that a horror movie had ever made it to our cinema, even less that it had been hidden there all this time. Of course, against all odds, that wasn't what worried me the most. I just thought about how excited my friends would be to see a real horror movie. It was a great find. The next day, I gathered my friends from school. I summoned them for after the midnight show, and when they finally arrived, I couldn't wait to show them the reel I had found. The excitement was reflected in their faces when I took the film out of the counter, and I was not far behind, eager to screen the film and see what it was all about. It was around 1:15 a.m. when we settled into the empty projection room. Once we were ready, I turned off the lights and we took our seats in the front row, watching the title, Los Olvidados, slowly appear on the screen. The film began like any other, with a group of 6 friends in a religious village similar to our own. But as it progressed, things began to get weird. I started to notice some rather disturbing details, like how the characters reminded me a little of my friends. At first, I thought I was just exaggerating, but there were too many similarities for me to ignore. And although the names and appearances were different, certain things about how they spoke, acted, and even the way they dressed were too similar. For example, the character Brad seemed too familiar to my friend Matt. They both had adoptive parents and loved skating as well as getting into trouble. The difference was that the Brad in the movie got good grades at school, while in reality my friend Matt cared little or nothing about studying. Then there was Julia, the athlete of the group, who resembled Mariana, as they were both part of the swimming team. However, Julia had real talent. She was good at multiple sports and she received offers from universities, something that Mariana could not say. Zach's character was called Saeed. They were both big party goers and smoked whatever they could get their hands on. But the key was that Saeed was Muslim and Zach had nothing to do with religion. There was also Jeanette, the classic good girl with good parents and excellent grades, which fitted her character, while Claire, the other character, got good grades by cheating and getting others to help her with her homework. Aside from the characters, something about the city and its streets felt strangely familiar, as if I'd experienced it before. However, at the time, I didn't think there was any connection between what we saw on the screen and our real lives, so it was too crazy to think that, especially since the plot revolved around a character I didn't recognize at all, Caroline. Caroline's story was our first glimpse of the real horror in the movie. To tell the truth, her story seemed more tragic than terrifying. That is to say, she was a teenager who, like us, lived in a religious village somewhat removed from modernity. But the plot revolved around how her family moved to the city to escape a dark past that tormented them. The atmosphere became thick. You could almost feel it. As the plot unfolded, I knew we had done the right thing by watching that movie, although I never imagined how far it could take us. My friends' laughter and jokes gradually faded as we were drawn into the darkness of the story, and without meaning to, we began to question whether some stories were destined to be told. It was at that moment that the mystery of Caroline began to unravel. It was as if the film decided to drag us into the darkest part of her story. It turned out that her parents had been accused of witchcraft in their previous village and of performing a whole host of evil rituals. However, after a time in the shadows, they believed they had started over in a safe place, but nothing went unnoticed, and when they found out about their crimes, the news spread like wildfire. Her supposed friends, starting with Claire, simply ignored her, and the community quickly turned against her. But that was only the beginning, because soon the whole town united to hunt them down. Caroline and her family went to the forest to stand trial, but what happened there was simply chilling. Instead of facing a fair trial, Caroline and her family were buried alive. This part of the movie was brutal, and it happened about halfway through the screening. After that, the story became a feast of grisly deaths of each secondary character. It was as if each of them were being punished for having betrayed Caroline. The first victim was Brad. One day, while he was returning from school on his skateboard, he hit a rock, and as he fell, he hit his head so hard that he died instantly. The scene was so graphic that it was difficult to ignore. I saw his skull burst and his brains spread across the ground. I had never seen anything so realistic in any modern movie. The scene looked so real that we all gasped in shock and my stomach churned. After that, it was Julia's turn. The scene showed her at swimming practice, where her coach gave the signal for them to enter the water. She jumped in immediately, but twisted her ankle and slowly sank, making a desperate effort to stay afloat. But she couldn't, so she began to panic at the thought of imminent drowning, while the coach and her teammates just looked at her, ignoring her calls for help. The scene was utterly despairing. Her agony could be felt, until finally her lungs filled with water and her body gave way. That image has remained with me forever. The horror cycle continued, and each death was longer and more harrowing than the last. Each fragment of blood and suffering so vivid that I could not bear it. Said's scene was equally shocking. It was the night after Brad's death and he was home alone. He forgot a cigarette in the kitchen, and in the middle of that, a gas leak broke. The explosion was devastating. We saw him scream and burst into flames, falling to his knees in the doorway of his house and fighting for survival. The boy struggled, screamed, and shook for almost 5 minutes as his body burned, coughing up blood until he finally died. Claire was next on Caroline's revenge list, and it was her death that really broke my boundaries. She was the first to betray Caroline, and she was attacked by a group of men who stabbed her on her way home. The scene showed her being brutally violated and mutilated, without even a minimum of censorship. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was on the edge of my seat, about to scream in horror and despair at the brutality of the scene. Finally, after that barbarity, they threw her into the same forest where Caroline's body had ended up. It was too much. I felt like I was going to faint, and I got up quickly, almost vomiting. My friends laughed when they saw me, thinking I was trying to scare them, but I could only feel that something strange and very bad was happening. I went to the bathroom and stayed there for about 25 minutes trying to calm down. When I came back, the movie had already ended, and my friends were getting up to leave. They seemed to have enjoyed it and were talking excitedly about how shocking it had been. For them, everything was normal, and they were laughing that I had been the only one terrified by the movie. After that, we headed for the exit together, but just as we were about to leave, Matt tripped on one of the steps and hit one of the rows of chairs hard, cracking his head open on the cinema floor. The sound of the impact echoed in my ears, and a stream of blood began to spread around his head. We all stood there, paralyzed, in shock, unable to process what had just happened before our eyes. After a moment of silence, we began to slowly approach Matt's body to see if he was alive. But just as we got closer, Mariana's expression suddenly changed, as if she had seen a ghost. I saw her grab her throat, struggling to breathe, and I knew something was definitely wrong. It was like a cruel, bad joke. What had started out as a simple movie night had turned into something completely terrifying. The images on the screen and reality were blending together, and I felt like I wasn't sure of anything anymore. When Mariana started coughing, we rushed to her side, perplexed and scared of what was happening. It was as if she were choking, and although we were there was nothing we could do. She was writhing around, struggling more and more to get some air, but before we knew it, she collapsed to the floor, completely inert. We stood there, paralyzed and terrified, as the line between reality and the movie blurred in an instant. In the midst of it all, my mind went blank, unable to process what had just happened. And just as I was trying to assimilate it, we heard a crackling sound that echoed around us. Suddenly, I felt a scorching heat behind me and turned to see Zach engulfed in flames. Jeanette and I backed away, horrified by his heart-rending screams, and took a couple of steps, but his body fell to the ground, convulsing in pain. My heart was racing. I felt like I was on the verge of a heart attack, and I couldn't stop thinking about what would come next. Who would be next? Jeanette looked lost, with a distant look in her eyes and an air of disbelief that was unsettling. It was as if her mind couldn't assimilate the horror unfolding before us. At that moment, her eyes scanned the room, and I noticed how her body visibly trembled. Having seen the above, I knew that I could not stay to contemplate that scene. So without thinking twice, I got up and ran out of the cinema into the cold darkness of the street. My only hope was to escape whatever evil fate awaited me. So I ran aimlessly, not really knowing where I was going. And before I knew it, I got home, ran up to my room and sat on the bed, my legs trembling and my chest rising and falling at breakneck speed. As I lay there, I struggled to understand what had happened that night. Somehow I had survived, but the images of my friends in agony were still trapped in my mind, tormenting me relentlessly. The police closed their investigation 3 months later. The deaths were so strange and baffling that they didn't know where to start investigating. As I feared, in the end, Janet suffered the same atrocious fate as Claire in the movie, which was completely crazy because there was no one else in that room when I fled. At first, the police tried to link me to the incident, thinking that I was the one who had caused the deaths of my friends. But the more they investigated, the more they entered a labyrinth with no exit, so they had no choice but to release me, and even more, to believe my story. And the fact is that, however implausible it all sounded, it became increasingly clear that the scene matched what I had told them, so they were as baffled as I was. I was tormented by the idea that my village was cursed, especially after what happened to Caroline's family in that forest. I began to question whether Caroline's story was even real, or if we were all destined to experience that horror. All I knew was that I escaped a terrifying fate at the last moment, just when I decided to go to the bathroom and, coincidentally, missed the most brutal scene. I left the village later that year after months of therapy. The community was never the same after that tragedy, and people started leaving one by one, while the houses filled with dust and cobwebs. They say nothing lasts forever, but the heart of our town seemed to be rotting from within, approaching the state of a ghost town. Over time, the cinema and every little corner of the place vanished, as if they had been erased from the map. Sometimes I wonder if the town, the movie, or even the cinema should have been buried long ago, rescued from the collective memory of the people who once inhabited that lost town called Golden Hills. For my part, although I tried to move on, what I experienced in that movie and the reality that surrounded us will never allow me to escape the horror that was unleashed that night. Hi, I'm Hugh Evans, and this story happened to me when I was living in a rented house in a small town in Nashville, Tennessee, where I lived with my wife for about 5 years. My wife and I got married young, so we decided to rent a place instead of buying one, as we were still trying to get on our feet financially. The only problem was that when we moved in, there was already another tenant, a guy called Greg Cooper, who was occupying the basement because he couldn't afford the rest of the house. At first, the idea of having a stranger living in the basement didn't excite us at all, but as there weren't many options, we decided we would have to get used to it. In the first few weeks, my wife and I tried hard to avoid any kind of interaction with Greg, but the weeks turned into months, and after a while, we started having dinner with him from time to time. At first, it was a bit weird, I won't deny it, but it ended up becoming part of our routine. 4 years went by like this, but at one point, Greg's behavior started to get strange. Although Greg had been a strange guy from the beginning, he suddenly started acting even stranger than normal. I started to notice that he was always coming home around 3 a.m., which was not at all usual. We knew it was him because the sound of his footsteps and strange noises from downstairs often woke us up. One day, I decided to ask him what was going on. "Hey Greg, why are you coming back so late now? We're hearing strange noises," I said. But his answer was quite casual. "Oh, my boss put me on night shifts, a real headache. But I'll be quieter next time. I didn't want to bother you." At the time, we trusted him and thought no more of the matter. We had no reason to think anything was wrong. Greg kept his promise for a while, but every now and then we would still wake up to those strange noises. A week later, my wife woke me up one morning with a worried expression. "Hey, I think there's a problem with our bathtub," she said. "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. "I'm not sure, just go take a look," she replied. I walked to the bathroom and found the bathtub full of dirty water, with strange things coming out of the drain. The toilets were also blocked, so we decided to ask Greg if he had the same problem in his basement. "Good morning, everyone," Greg greeted enthusiastically, sitting on the sofa. I could tell straight away that he hadn't had a shower, as he smelled a bit funny. "Greg, we have a problem with the bath and the toilets. They're blocked. Do you think you could help us, or should we call a plumber?" He immediately seemed concerned and said, "No, it's not necessary. The pipes here always do this. Let me fix it right now." Without thinking, he quickly went up to the bathroom, did something, and in the end, the toilet seemed to work again, so we thanked him and he just smiled before returning to his area in the basement. But strangely enough, the next day, everything was back to normal. Every time we told Greg that we needed to call a plumber, he flatly refused. "It's a normal situation, I can take care of it," he repeated. But after 3 weeks of this cycle, my wife and I decided it was time to contact a professional. When the plumbers arrived, Greg opened the door and his expression was not exactly friendly. In fact, he seemed nervous and somewhat angry, but we didn't think too much of it because it was necessary. It was clear that he couldn't solve it definitively. Finally, he let the plumbers in and my wife quickly took them to the bathroom to show them what was wrong. At that moment, Greg came up to me and grabbed my arm and growled, "Why did you call them? I told you I would take care of it." I was surprised. I had never seen Greg act like that before. "Relax," I replied. "We're paying for everything. There's no reason to get like that." But just at that moment, one of the plumbers interrupted. "Well, sir, we've inspected and it looks like the problem is in the main drain. It should be in the basement." Greg was enraged to hear this, and I really didn't understand what was wrong with him. But he finally let go of me and told the plumbers to follow him to the basement. We had been living together for 4 years, and we had rarely gone into Greg's room as we respected each other's privacy. But when we went in this time, we were completely stunned. His room was a complete mess. There were joints, empty bottles, and rotten food everywhere. What's more, the room was soaked and there was a stench of sewage that turned my stomach and almost made me vomit right there. It was like entering a mess of chaos, and suddenly I felt trapped in a bad dream. The plumbers started work immediately, and my wife and I decided to stay upstairs, leaving them to handle the situation. Greg, on the other hand, stayed in his room, saying he didn't trust them and kept a close eye on them. We waited in silence, feeling a little uneasy, and after about an hour, the plumbers finally emerged from the basement. One of them, looking panicked, showed me a small piece of plastic in his hand. "Everything's fine now," he said, but he didn't seem convinced, and before I could ask about the cost of the service, they rushed out of the house as if they were running away from something. Greg still hadn't come out of the basement, and all we could hear was his voice dragging things around frantically until, suddenly, his heart-rending scream echoed throughout the place, breaking the silence. It was the first time I had heard him like that. It was very strange, and I didn't understand what was happening to Greg. He had always been calm and reserved, but now he seemed like a different person. My wife and I decided to stay away from the basement. Instead, we went up to our room as we hadn't been able to shower properly that day. About 3 hours passed and the house was strangely quiet. It was then that worry began to take hold of us. "Hey, I'm a little worried about Greg," said my wife. "Maybe we should check on him." I tried to think that she was exaggerating, but I was also a little worried about Greg's condition. "Sure, I'll be right behind you," I replied. When my wife opened the door, she was confronted by a disturbing sight. Greg was standing in the hallway, his huge figure leaning forward. Greg was about 1.95 meters tall, so he was hard to mistake. We noticed that his face was hidden by his disheveled hair and his lips were murmuring something inaudible, and she didn't even realize how strange he looked. "Greg, stop scaring me," she blurted out, laughing nervously. At that moment, she didn't notice the heavy air that enveloped him, but I did. I knew something wasn't right. I moved slowly, trying to get closer, feeling a chilling tension in the air, but just when I thought I could handle the situation, Greg lunged towards my wife, grabbed her by the neck, and in a brutal movement threw her down the stairs. My heart sank as I heard her scream, followed by a dull thud. I immediately ran towards the stairs, punching Greg in my path while she was on the ground with her eyes open but motionless and gasping for air. Tears began to well up in my eyes as I ran towards her, trying to comfort her. But in the midst of all that, I heard Greg coming down the stairs, each step he took echoing on the wood. And when he finally appeared before me, he had a huge knife in his hand, and his face was an icy mask of calm. "I didn't want to do this, you know," he said in a slow voice, as if he were teaching a child something important. "You are like family to me. I really love you, but I don't think this can go on. Living with other people has been a bigger problem than I imagined," he continued as he slowly approached. His gaze was full of a disturbing intensity, and in that moment I knew that the house, our home until now, had become a much more terrifying place than we had ever imagined. Suddenly, Greg began to pace the room, walking back and forth calmly. It was as if he were in his own world, talking to himself. No, I can't kill them," he muttered, and suddenly he turned to face me, as if responding to his own thoughts, and pointed the knife at me. "But you must know that there is no problem now." I was simply paralyzed with horror, seeing a side of him that I had never seen before. This man was crazy. How come we never realized it, I thought. Suddenly, Greg stopped and his gaze fixed on me. "I'm sorry, Hugh," he said with chilling calm, and started to approach again. But before I could even open my mouth to beg him not to hurt us, the doorbell rang. At that moment, I felt a knot in my stomach. Greg didn't seem to notice the chaos he had unleashed, and when he turned to me, he put a finger to his lips as if asking for silence and went to the door. When he opened it, a wave of relief washed over me as I saw 3 police officers in the doorway. But Greg, instead of getting scared, chuckled and said, "Well, it looks like someone fell down here, isn't that funny?" Then he let himself go, saying, "Okay, you caught me. There's a body there, and if you want the rest, they're in the freezer." At that moment, the policeman and I realized that we were facing something horrible, so they arrested Greg and called an ambulance. As they were taking him away, Greg turned to me and with a twisted smile said, "Hugh, I hope Eva is okay." That was the last time I saw him. The following weeks were a real shock. The chilling details that came to light about Greg were too disturbing. It turned out that the plumbers we had hired had informed the authorities immediately after leaving our house. They had found a piece of a human hand stuck in the drains, something that Greg didn't bother to deny. The police identified the body found in the freezer. It was an 18-year-old girl named Shina Richards who had been missing for 6 months. In addition, in Greg's room, they found a knife that contained the DNA of another girl who had been missing for 4 years. During the interrogation, the police could not believe Greg's total lack of remorse. He seemed almost excited when talking about his crimes and did not care at all about the families of the victims. After reviewing the recordings of his interrogation, the court labeled him a true psychopath and decided that he deserved nothing less than the death penalty. So he was executed on December 8, 2019, leaving as his final message the phrase, "Tell my family I'll see them soon." His words echoed in my head, and I couldn't help feeling that we had all been living next to a monster. Last year, I decided to rent an Airbnb in a small town in Canada near my cousin's house to spend the holidays. He lives in a fairly isolated area, so there were only cabins available, so I chose one almost at random and arrived a few days before Christmas. The first part of the trip was great. I spent time with a part of my family I hadn't seen in years, and it was great to catch up. But then things got a little complicated, and around 30 of us ended up crammed into his 3-bedroom house. Yes, it was as bad as you might imagine. It was chaos. Christmas Day was particularly hectic. We spent the morning watching the children open presents, enjoyed a big breakfast, and I stayed until dinner. At 7 p.m., I decided it was time to retire and return to the cabin, which was in the middle of a forest just outside the city. The cabin was actually quite cozy, but when I parked, I noticed some footprints in the snow leading to the front door that hadn't been there before. At the time, I thought they might be from the host, who might have come to see how everything was going. But when I got to the door, I realized there was no sign that anyone had entered. In the end, I decided to ignore it and went in. I threw my jacket on the sofa and collapsed into a chair. I thought about sending the host a message to ask what had happened, but then I realized that if it was really serious, he would have contacted me by now, so I let it go. I had been on the sofa for only a few minutes when I fell asleep, and no more than 10 minutes must have passed when the doorbell rang. At that moment, I woke up with a start, and still a little dazed, I went to open the door. As I did so, I was met by a guy with straight dark hair wearing a brown jacket. He smiled briefly as he introduced himself as the Airbnb host. To be honest, I was still half asleep, so I let him do the talking. He asked me how my stay had been and then told me he just needed to check a few things in the cabin before he left. I just nodded, without thinking too much about what he was saying. It was only when he passed by me and went into the house that I realized that, somehow, I had let a stranger in without thinking twice. Suddenly, I woke up completely and saw that he started to look around, almost as if he didn't know what he was looking for. That strange behavior made my hair stand on end, and I immediately went into alert mode. Why would he have to be checking something at Christmas? Couldn't he have waited until the next day? I started to tell him that maybe it would be better if he came back tomorrow because I was expecting more family. But when I did, his expression turned severe. He turned towards me and his face hardened as if he were annoyed by what I had said. Then he casually walked towards the door, and just when I thought he was going to leave, he closed the door and put the key in the lock. At that moment, I felt panic rising in my stomach, and I knew immediately that I was in danger, so I ran quickly to the room and slammed the door shut. And just a few seconds later, I heard him trying frantically to open it. I didn't know what to do. My phone and car keys were in my jacket on the sofa, so I had to act fast. I looked behind the house and saw an old window, one with a handle that opened like a hatch, so I hurried to open it, and I could hear the door creaking with every attempt the guy made to get in. I finally managed to get out the window and ran towards the trees, feeling as if my feet were barely touching the ground. Then I looked back and saw that the guy had run out the front door. He was plunged into darkness, but he stood there for a while, looking in all directions, clearly confused because he didn't know where I had gone. And an eternal 15 or 20 minutes passed before he finally got into his car and drove off. My heart almost leapt out of my chest just thinking about what could have happened to me if I hadn't been able to escape through that window, so I decided to wait a few more minutes just to make sure he had really left. And when I saw that it was safe, I ran back to the cabin and called 911. During the call, the real owner of the place and the Airbnb host came down to confirm that the guy was an imposter, and that what had happened was very strange. They assumed that he had probably found out that the cabin was an Airbnb and had used that to get in, but the worst part was that we never knew what his intentions were. That night was unsettling and definitely left a very bad taste in my mouth. I learned that I should never trust a stranger so quickly again, so now I'm always on my guard, especially if I find myself in a similar situation. Sometimes even a simple getaway can turn into a nightmare. The truth is that a 10-year-old shouldn't have to endure the trauma of what happened that day in September. It was just one day before Halloween, September 30th, and as I was babysitting Benjamin, my best friend's son, I decided it would be fun to stay at my house. Benjamin, or Benji, as I affectionately call him, is a little boy I've known forever. I was even at the hospital when he was born. His mother, Cleo, had left him with me once before, but it only lasted a short while because the poor thing fell ill. However, on this day, Benji was full of energy and eager to spend time with me. I live in a small 3-bedroom house in a small town in southern Missouri, and my street is a cul-de-sac, which gives me peace of mind. There is a lot of forest behind the house, and on those silent nights, I really enjoyed the calm it provided. I remember that the kitchen still smelled of the spaghetti I had just made, and I was surprised at how much the little one was devouring it. The truth is that I was proud that he liked what I cooked, and I even sent Cleo a message to brag. At about 9 o'clock in the evening, Benji was already in his pajamas, curled up on the sofa. I sat down next to him as I was exhausted from the week and asked him if he didn't think it was time to go to bed, to which he mischievously replied, "Maybe for you," and that made me laugh. I must admit that I had a soft spot for Benji. I loved him like a nephew, and that's why he always got his way with me. That day was no exception, so I decided to let him stay up a little longer, but I warned him that he should go to bed at 10:30. He accepted without complaint and continued watching his program. Shortly afterwards, I went to my room and fell into bed like a log. I probably fell asleep in seconds. Then I remember having a horrible nightmare, before Benji woke me up by shaking my bed. I opened my eyes with a start, still confused and shaken by the nightmare. And that was when I saw him in front of me, and I let out a cry. "What's wrong, Benji?" "I'm hungry," he replied, but it sounded a little strange, almost as if he were scared. "You had 2 big bowls of spaghetti, sweetheart," I said. Then he paused and looked at me with eyes full of fear. "I want more," he whispered. I wasn't in the best mood at the time, and honestly, it annoyed me a little. "I don't like waking up at this hour, Benji. Besides, you promised to go to bed. You'll have breakfast tomorrow," I said, pulling the covers over my head and closing my eyes again. But in less than 10 seconds, I could feel him shaking the bed again and whispering that he really needed spaghetti. Unable to believe what I was hearing, I turned and looked at him strangely. He had never behaved like that before, but as always, I ended up giving in. All right, I replied as I dragged myself out of bed and followed him through the dark house to the kitchen. However, before we reached the fridge, he grabbed me tightly by the wrist, and I looked at him and saw that his eyes were full of tears and he was trembling. "What's wrong, Benji?" I asked him. "There's a man in your room. He's under the bed," he said nervously. I honestly found it hard to believe him. "There's no one under my bed," I replied incredulously. But before I could continue talking, a crunching noise was heard in the hallway. We were both paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do. "It can't be," I thought as I looked back at him and noticed that Benji started to cry. That was what brought me out of my catatonic state, and I finally decided to act. I picked up Benji and ran to the back door. When I got there, I opened it with a jerk and darted out into the backyard, which was completely dark, but once outside, I realized that I had left my phone on the dresser in my room. But of course, I wasn't going to go back to look for it. So I did the first thing that came to mind. I decided to run to the house of my closest neighbor and ask for help. With Benjamin clinging to my hand, I ran through the woods towards my neighbor's yard. But in the middle of the run, I hit my little toe on something. The pain was excruciating, and asked for help. With Benjamin clinging to my hand, I ran through the woods towards my neighbor's yard. But in the middle of the run, I hit my little toe on something. The pain was very intense, but I kept moving. When I was a few meters from my neighbor's backyard, I took a quick look towards my house. There I saw that the door to my garage was open, and inside, I had the horrible impression of seeing a shadow of a man moving. That was the most distressing run of my life, the sound of my footsteps resonating in the silence of the night, and at the same time I feared that the man in my house was behind me. Somehow, I finally managed to reach the neighbor's house, and from there I called the police. A few minutes later, the lights and sirens broke the silence, and that gave me some relief. The officers searched my house from top to bottom, but they didn't find the intruder. They only realized that the window in my room was open and that the stranger probably fled into the forest. From that day until now, I still don't know who was under my bed, how they got there or when, and what's worse, what their intentions were. For a long time, I strongly suspected it was Damon, my crazy ex-boyfriend, but I backed off when I ran into him once in a restaurant where I had coffee with a friend and confronted him about it. He told me he had no idea what I was talking about, and the truth is that his bewilderment seemed genuine. Now I often have nightmares about that night, waking up drenched in sweat, while terrifying images of Benji and I being brutally attacked by an intruder play in my head. I can no longer sleep peacefully. What's more, the relationship with Benji's mom has cooled. We're not as close as we used to be. We just send each other messages to find out how things are going. But that's it. She always says that Benji still loves me, but of course, he doesn't dare to stay with me anymore, and I don't feel like blaming him either. In April 2010, a guy called Tom Reynolds decided to put a small diamond ring up for sale on Craigslist. Tom lived in a small, quiet community called Edgewood, Washington, with his wife Mary and their 2 children aged 10 and 8. Shortly after posting the ad, he received a message from someone interested in buying it, and Tom invited this stranger to his house so he could see the ring in person before closing the deal. On the night of April 28th, a man and a woman arrived at the Reynolds' door, exactly as they had agreed. Mary, who was at home, thought they were a friendly couple. She even found them adorable, and thought the ring would be a perfect engagement gift. After agreeing on a price, Tom asked them how they planned to pay, and that's when everything took a sinister turn. Suddenly, the man pulled out a gun and Tom froze, unable to do anything but hand over the ring, while the woman burst out laughing. Before Tom could understand what was happening, the man and woman ran to the back door, making way for 2 more accomplices to enter the house, and in an instant, the whole family was forced to kneel in the living room while the thieves tied their hands behind their backs. Once they had the family under control, they began to demand to know where they had hidden other valuables. But with a gun pointed at his head, Tom was too overwhelmed with fear to say a word. "It's the countdown. 3, 2, said the robber, pointing the gun at him. And every time he looked at his children, he felt more panic. In the middle of this nightmare, Mary, desperate, begged God not to hurt them, but the situation was terrifying, and the thieves knew that the longer they spent in the house, the greater the chances of the police arriving, so they began to ransack it in a hurry. While one of the robbers stayed in the living room, intimidating the family, the other 2 began to search the bedrooms. Their threats were so terrifying that the children, unable to contain their fear, began to cry desperately, and this only made the robbers even more nervous, fearing that the screams would attract the attention of the neighbors. Then the thief who was watching the Reynolds began to threaten the children, demanding that they be quiet. But when the children's cries intensified, the thief, increasingly furious, decided that he had to teach them a lesson. With the parents paralyzed with terror, Mary offered her own wedding ring in the hope that it would calm the assailant. "Take whatever you want, just don't hurt them," she shouted. That night turned into a living hell. Mary remembered how they took her wedding ring, feeling her world fall apart. Meanwhile, Tom tried to keep a cool head. He knew that material things could be replaced, but not his family. The rage he felt was growing by the second, but he was completely powerless in that situation. Suddenly, one of the thieves, fed up with the children's crying, began to hit them, and seeing his children being attacked, Tom's protective instinct kicked in, and in a rush of adrenaline, he managed to break the ties, and without thinking, he lunged at the thief who was assaulting his children, screaming and hitting like a madman, determined to end the nightmare. As we all know, in the movies, the heroes always manage to deflect the bullets and finish off the villains. but the reality is much harsher and more unfair. Just as Tom tried to turn the situation around, the thief stepped back, took aim, and fired 3 bullets that hit Tom's body, taking his life in an instant and without any mercy. At that moment, the scene turned into chaos, and Mary felt time stand still as horror was unleashed before her eyes. It was the worst moment of the Reynolds' lives. Tom fell to the ground, motionless and covered in his own blood. All this in front of their children and Mary. She, paralyzed with fear and despair, could only watch as her world fell apart, unable to understand how she had arrived at this horrific night. The life they had built, their home and their children, were all on the line, and the worst part was that they had no idea how it would all end. "Darling, please don't go. Stay with us," Mary kept repeating, her voice faltering. Her husband was dead and she couldn't believe what was happening. He had always promised to protect them, and now his life was fading before her eyes. He had been a hero to the end, defending his family at the most critical moment. But as she was flooded with horror, she also felt gratitude that she and the children were alive. And in her mind, she thanked God for keeping them safe, while her emotions overwhelmed her. However, at that moment she was devastated. The trauma she had suffered was too much to take in, and several of those who had caused this tragedy also seemed horrified by what had happened. The murderer's accomplices now seemed very scared and dismayed. Everything seemed to indicate that they had not planned a murder, and now they had gotten into something much bigger than they thought. Now, a simple robbery had turned into a homicide, and they knew they couldn't escape that so easily. So after gathering what they could of the loot, they quickly left the scene, taking with them cell phones, a laptop, jewelry, and everything else they could carry. The police sirens would soon be wailing, and they were aware that the heat would be closing in on them, so they headed south, crossing the state of Oregon and reaching the California border. The homicide detectives got to work quickly, and it didn't take them long to find the only serious mistake the criminals had made. They had sent emails from an account linked to one of their real names, and that was their downfall. Their names appeared on a popular television program that showed the most wanted criminals, and also on all the news programs in the country. They were 4 heroin addicts who, as if that were not enough, had had the brilliant idea of removing the license plate from the car they used to escape. As soon as they arrived in San Francisco, they were arrested at a traffic stop and brought to justice. In court, the suspects cried when they were charged with first-degree murder, robbery, and assault, and each of them pleaded not guilty. Their performance led many to believe that they were innocent, and that a mistake had probably been made. However, little by little, the prosecutors pieced together the story, showing piece by piece that they were indeed responsible for Tom's death. The decisive moment came when Mary appeared in court. She stood before the judge and jury with a firmness that shocked them all, and without hesitation identified the 4 criminals as the ones who had invaded her home and murdered her husband. Her testimony was vital in ensuring that, in 2011, they were all convicted on all charges and received sentences of between 71 and 124 years in prison. While on death row, the man who pulled the trigger told a journalist that he felt deeply sorry for what he had done. He spoke of how he prayed every night for Tom's family, believing that no one deserved to go through something like that. But when asked, the county prosecutor said that it was not shame that this murderer felt, but a profound lack of empathy because he was a psychopath. The truth is that those who entered the Reynolds home that night were not people who felt ashamed or regretful of anything. They were individuals willing to harm and take lives without thinking twice, even innocent children. The echo of what happened was etched not only in the hearts of the family, but also in the memory of all who heard Mary's story of loss and courage. In the midst of tragedy, she rose up stronger than ever, remembering her husband and vowing that injustice would never be forgiven. I never thought that a simple knock on the door could turn our lives upside down, but that morning changed everything. This happened over 40 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. For months, my friends and I, Ben, Alex, and Will, had been trapped in a routine that sounded like a bad joke. We were good carpenters, but the lack of work in our small town had made us feel like shadows of what we used to be. Ben and Alex were experts, always willing to teach what they knew. Will, on the other hand, was the strong, silent type of the group, a giant of a guy, the kind that intimidates everyone, but who always seemed to be on another planet. Every day we started the same way. We had breakfast at a cafe on the corner, where the coffee tasted like burnt rubber and the conversations were as boring as our situation. Then we'd go back to my place, checking out job ads while having a few beers and acting like we really thought something was going to change. But that morning, the atmosphere felt different. There was a kind of tension in the air, as if something bad was coming. "Something's wrong," said Ben, as he paced back and forth, looking at the window every few seconds. Alex, usually talkative, was quiet and tapping the table nervously. Will, meanwhile, sat there lost in thought, staring at the wall as if he could see through it. "I don't like this," Ben muttered, and there was a certainty in his voice that made me frown, as if he had a sixth sense for the uncanny. Just then, a knock on the door resounded, 3 loud, urgent raps. My heart skipped a beat, and the feeling of tension was palpable between us. I don't know why, but something about that sound gave me goosebumps. However, I got up and opened the door, and there I found a tall guy wearing a suit that was a bit too big for him, as if he had taken it from someone else's wardrobe. The man was wearing dark sunglasses, even though the weather outside was cloudy, and his posture seemed disconcerting. He was like a wolf in sheep's clothing. "Are you guys looking for work?" he asked in a soft, almost casual voice, but there was something in his tone that made me feel uncomfortable. "Yes, we are," I replied, trying not to let my voice tremble too much. "I have an offer for you. It pays well, but it's not what you'd call conventional," he said as he took out a card and handed it to me. "Meet me at this address at 9 p.m. tonight. We'll talk about all the details there," he said, and without further ado, the guy turned and left before I could ask him any more questions. My friends and I stared at the card in my hand, which didn't have a name on it, just a scribbled address. "What do you think?" Alex asked, his tone reflecting his insecurity. "I don't think we have much choice," I replied, feeling the weight of those months without work crushing down on us. We needed money and something to give us a sense of direction, so that night, we got ready as best we could and went to the address we had been given. It was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The facade looked worn, and something in the air told me that we were about to embark on something we couldn't imagine. Upon entering, the dim light revealed a place that seemed to have nothing to do with a normal job, and the uneasiness grew inside me as we ventured further into that unknown space. When we entered the warehouse, the guy was waiting for us, but he wasn't alone. There were 2 other men by his side, all of them with an appearance that made you think they could break you in 2 without breaking a sweat. "The job is simple," said the guy, and at least that seemed to be the theory. It turned out that the man needed us to reinforce a room in the basement. He didn't explain why, and we didn't ask. There was a tension in the air that told us it was better not to pry. In the end, it was work, so we accepted. As we nailed down wooden beams, the uneasiness grew. "Why would anyone need such a secure room?" Alex whispered to me, looking around suspiciously. "Don't think about it," I replied, but I was thinking about it too. We all were, especially Will, who had been acting strange since we arrived. At that moment, his usual calm had been replaced by a kind of melancholy intensity, and I caught him looking at the door more than once, as if he were expecting someone to come in. We finished the job and were about to leave when the guy stopped us. "One more thing," he said, and his soft voice now sounded sharper. "You can't tell anyone about this." The way he said it chilled me to the bone. It wasn't a request, it was a threat. We left there with the money, but the atmosphere between us was heavy. I could see the same question reflected in Ben and Alex's eyes. What have we just done? The next day, Will had disappeared, without a word, without a trace. We tried calling him, We went to his house and to his parents' house, but it was like he had evaporated. A few days later, the news announced that they had found a body in the river, shattered and unrecognizable. They didn't say it was Will, but we all knew it was. I couldn't stop thinking about the room we had built, about the guy's cold eyes, and about Will's agonizing silence. Months passed and we tried to move on, but the past always finds a way back. One night, I heard a knock on the door, and when I opened it, I found Ben with a pale expression and holding a worn notebook. "Look what I found," he said, and he began to turn the pages. It was Will's notebook, full of notes about the job, the guy, and something more disturbing, a hidden compartment in the room we had reinforced. Without thinking, we decided to return to the warehouse, just Ben and I. We had no idea what we were looking for, but we needed answers. There we found the compartment just as Will had written. Inside, there was a good amount of cash, but there was also a letter. It was from Will. I knew what that room was and what it hid, and I was convinced that the guy wouldn't let us get away so easily. Will had planned everything. He had taken something valuable from the man, something that would make him think twice about coming after us. The money was his way of making sure we were okay, that we could get out and start over. So we did it. That very night, we left the city, dividing the money between us. It wasn't much, but it was enough to leave the darkness behind and look for some light. In the end, Will saved us, and although the guilt was still there, I knew he had done what he had to do for us.